Thank you very much, Mikkel, and thank you very much for having me here today. Now, when I sent in the abstract for this conference, asking if the conference organisers would be interested in me coming here to give a talk, they wrote back and said they would, but could I talk a little bit less about the law and a little bit more about the media? So I'm going to try and do that, but with the caveat that I'm taking myself a little bit outside of my comfort zone. I'm not a media expert or a media academic or a journalism academic. My background, I'm not even a media lawyer. My background is in human rights law. But I hope that I can perhaps bring a slightly different perspective to the discussion today. What I want to try and do in the next 20 minutes or so is introduce some thoughts concerning narrative and narrative formation as a source of justice in the context of deaths at the hands of the police. I'm going to use some examples, and this is where I'm going to talk about the media, that are illustrative of what I think is a significant problem that manifests itself most clearly through the complicity of news media in state talk. But I'm going to use this, I'm not going to use this as a starting point for a kind of critical analysis of the relationship between the state and the media, but rather I hope to illustrate why narrative and narrative formation can be real sources of injustice and justice. And I'll end by suggesting that at least part of the answer to this kind of state-media complicity problem and the injustices that can result out of that problem, I found, at least part of it is found outside of the functioning of the media. I do not think it's reasonable or realistic to expect these kind of problems to be addressed only by the media, whether it be through stricter regulation of media standards or the regulation of the relationship between the state and the media, or the police and the media. I'll suggest that not only is it possible for state institutions to provide the forum for just narrative formation, but it's actually their responsibility to do so. And in this respect, the European Court of Human Rights is in agreement with that point. Now, I borrowed the phrase challenging state talk from a 2008 paper by a man called Simon Pemberton, who wrote a really interesting article in 2008, as I say, entitled Demystifying Deaths in Police Custody, Challenging State Talk. Now, while I've borrowed from the title, my purposes and Simon Pemberton's purposes are very different. In Pemberton's words, his article seeks to challenge the discourses of danger and disorder that state talk preaches in order to maintain authoritarian populism's hold over the historical bloc. So when he talks about challenging state talk, he is the one challenging state talk in his article. The aim of my research, however, is to suggest normative procedural standards that provide a forum where state talk can be routinely and systematically challenged, where someone has died at the hands of the state. So instead of being on an ad hoc basis by people like Simon Pemberton, by certain more responsible elements of the media, or in the very rare cases where there are criminal prosecutions of state agents when they cause a death. And one of the few examples is, you can't see it very clearly on the slide, that's Ian Tomlinson, who died in the G20 riots in 2009, and his family. There was actually a prosecution in that case, although the police officer involved was in fact acquitted. Now let's look at some historical examples of where state talk has needed to be challenged and where the so-called Fourth Estate has perhaps needed a little bit of help in fulfilling that Fourth Estate role. The first example I want to look at is that of Joy Gardner, who died in 1993. Now, this is an example that Simon Pemberton uses as well, but he focuses on the media's portrayal and the state's portrayal of Joy Gardner herself as somehow unhinged and deranged. Whereas I think there's actually a really interesting example here of how the media can be complicit in the state's vilification of an entire community, not just the direct victim of the state's violence. Now, Joy was a 40-year-old Jamaican mother who had overstayed her visa in the UK. And on the 28th of July 1993, 5 police officers and an immigration official entered her home at about 7 o'clock in the morning in order to detain her to begin the process of forcibly removing her from the country. They restrained her using a thick leather body belt with handcuffs attached to it. They also put belts around her legs and her arms. and they wrapped 13 feet, or it's about 4 meters, of adhesive tape around her head. And Joy collapsed and died about 4 hours later. Now, the unquestioning acceptance in the Evening Standard example that I'm using, the Evening Standard article that I'm using as an example here, the unquestioning acceptance of the police version of events that led to Joy's death is telling. But I think the most shocking aspect, as I say, is the portrayal of an entire community as dangerous and unhinged. And I'll just read a little quote from that article. They, the police officers involved, are confident that every aspect of the deportation was carried out according to the laid-down procedures, said a source. But the claims of Joy's mother over the way her daughter died could threaten the fragile peace forged by the police in the wake of her death. There are fears that a protest rally on Saturday will become a march of hate as anger in the black community is filmed by political activists. So after a line describing the police as peacemakers, the paper in one sentence blames predicted disorder on Joy's mother for raising questions about the circumstances of her daughter's death, the black community who are about to take part in a march of hate, and the political activists who are about to add fuel to that march of hate. The rest of the article practically ignores the circumstances of Joy's death entirely, preferring the story of the alleged unfair internal treatment of the police officers who were responsible for her death. It may seem obvious, but this amounts to a real injustice to the individuals concerned. I'm talking about the individuals connected to Joy Gardner. So in addition to the original injustice of having a loved one killed, Joy's mother suffers the injustice of having her voice dismissed as being a threat to the peace. The community attempts to appropriate a voice for itself by organising a public demonstration. But this demonstration is not treated by the media as a legitimate democratic exercise to voice legitimate concerns about the death of a member of that community. Rather, it is also dismissed, and this time as a march of hate. Now, these injustices are very profoundly felt by the people involved, and I've experienced that as a lawyer representing people like the family of Joy Gardner. And I've later got a couple of quotes that I hope illustrate this to some degree. The next example that I want to look at is the death of Jean-Charles de Menezes in 2005, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. Menezes was an entirely innocent Brazilian man who was mistaken for a suicide bomber shortly after the London bombings. He was shot by police 5 times in the head at point-blank range on a train carriage full of terrified commuters. And you can see the original headline shortly after the bombing, the shooting, which says "Bomber shot dead on the tube." And the police allowed that story to remain in the public sphere, that he was in fact a bomber, even though they very quickly realised that he was not in fact a suicide bomber. So upon it becoming clear that Menezes was not in fact a suicide bomber, the now defunct News of the World ran the story, "Why did he run?" basically intimating that Jean-Charles de Menezes' behaviour had brought the tragedy, so he had brought the tragedy on himself by the way he behaved. Again, there was no hint that the police may have been to blame for his death. The article in the News of the World was not the only media outlet to put this story out there. But the article claimed that before he was shot, Menezes was acting suspiciously, that he was wearing a suspiciously bulky jacket despite the warm weather, and that when he was challenged at the entrance to the train station, the underground station, and he ran, and he jumped over the ticket barrier and ran down the escalators. Now, this account turned out to be completely false. At the inquest into Menezes' death, there was CCTV footage, video footage, which showed that he wasn't acting suspiciously. He was wearing a light denim jacket, which you can actually see in the photograph there, which was perfectly appropriate for the weather at the time. He walked into the train station. He casually picked up a free newspaper. He paid for his ticket with his travel card, and he walked through the barriers, the ticket barriers, and down the escalators. Now, subsequent to the inquest, some newspapers and television news acknowledged the inaccuracies in earlier reports and questioned how they had allowed these inaccuracies to be put into the public domain, because they were obviously quite easily verifiable. And most of the media blamed their police sources for the disinformation. The News of the World, I've tried to find the News of the World coverage of the inquest and couldn't, so it appears that they completely ignored the inquest. Perhaps the most shocking example in recent history of a sustained cover-up of police negligence or misconduct with a campaign of disinformation by the police with elements of the media was that which followed the Hillsborough disaster. So this falls slightly outside of my thesis topic, as these were not use of force deaths, but more the result of appalling negligence, more than anything else. There we go. But I think it's a good example of the scale of how state and media can, hand-in-hand, manipulate a narrative and cause relatives of the dead and entire communities huge pain and a huge sense of injustice in terms of the public narrative of what happened. So at Hillsborough, 96 football fans, including women and children, were crushed to death at the Hillsborough Football Stadium in Sheffield after police failed to control the flow of football supporters to the stadium. And then they opened up a ticket barrier that led into part of the stadium that was already full of football supporters. Michael Mansfield, who's a very well-known lawyer in Britain, described the police cover-up that followed the disaster as the biggest in British legal history. The Sun newspaper wrote a notorious story, headlined "The Truth," blaming fans for the disaster, saying that they forced the ticket barrier open and rushed into the stadium. It said that they were drunk, that most of the football fans were drunk. It said that they stole from the dead, that they beat up police officers, and that they urinated on the dead and dying. The source of the story turned out to be members of the South Yorkshire Police Service and a Conservative Member of Parliament. Now, after 20 years of tireless campaigning by the families of the deceased and Liverpool football supporters, an independent panel was set up by the government in 2010 to oversee the public disclosure of government and other official documents relating to the disaster. Now, the panel was a very strange beast in legal terms, but it undertook an inquiry of sorts by consulting with people affected by the disaster and involved at the time, and producing a report based on the thousands of documents that had been disclosed to it. And this report was published in September 2012 and put before Parliament by the current government. Now, the impact of the report is huge and is still being felt today. And in fact, the Chief Constable of South Yorkshire Police is awaiting today an Independent Police Complaints Commission report on the misinformation or the alleged misinformation he was responsible for shortly following the disaster. Now, I don't have time to go into the panel's findings in any detail, but it blamed the disaster squarely on the police, the Football Association and the stadium owners. The football fans themselves were completely exonerated of any blame. And if you would have been able to see the video clip, you would have seen that there were cameras everywhere and they didn't pick up any violence on the part of football supporters. The panel found that the South Yorkshire Police pushed the story of drunkenness and aggression among Liverpool fans, alleging many of them arrived at the stadium late, without tickets and determined to force entry. The South Yorkshire Police Chief Constable in particular encouraged junior officers to present a rock-solid story and falsely blaming the supporters for causing the disaster and thus exonerating the police. The panel found that there was no evidence to support the allegations of drunkenness, ticketlessness or violence by supporters, which were spread by the police. And probably worst of all, the panel discovered 164 written statements of junior officers who were present at the scene had been altered by senior officers and the police force's lawyers, and that 116 of those were substantially amended to avoid, to remove or alter comments that were unfavourable to South Yorkshire Police. As I say, it had a big impact, the panel's report, and one of those was for the media to rewrite their narrative. The Sun issued a kind of an apology for their responsibility putting the false information out there, although they blamed, as you can see in the headline, they blamed the police for it. And the report had a big impact with many fans and many relatives of the deceased celebrating the fact that their voice had finally been heard and the truth had come out. And on the T-shirt it says, "The truth, now justice at last." For some, the belated acknowledgement of the truth was slightly bittersweet. And here's Becky Shah, who lost her mother at Hillsborough, who said, "I have mixed feelings. I'm really relieved that Liverpool fans, survivors and the dead have been exonerated and the city of Liverpool too. But I was a young woman of 17 who lost her only parent at Hillsborough, and the fact it has taken more than half of my life to get to this point is absolutely outrageous in a democratic society." Now, these are not just three examples of bad reporting, in my opinion. These are three examples of significant injustice perpetrated by the state hand in hand with certain elements of the media. Giving the victims a voice and creating a reliable public narrative that documents and rigorously tests the truth is a vital part of justice. And you just have to look at the increase in the use of truth commissions for states undergoing the transition from normalised state violence to democratic institutions based on with respect for human rights. And I believe that the three examples that I've given illustrate how the media can contrive with the state in narrative and narrative formation in a way that can create three areas of injustice. First, there's the injustice. There's an injustice where the formation of a one-sided narrative denies primary and secondary victims a voice. And if we were to categorise this, I would argue that this amounts to a procedural injustice or a denial of justice as recognition. Second, by covering up the truth or ignoring the truth, there is a failure of restorative justice, where further damage to the community is caused by a failure to restore intersubjective relationships between next of kin, communities and the general public on one side and the state on the other. These intersubjective relationships can only truly be restored where there is confidence that voices have been heard, that failings have been acknowledged, and that lessons will be learnt for the future. And finally, there is an injustice where every failure to expose the truth of state violence denies the public the democratic choices that can only come from being a properly informed citizenry. And again, I would argue that this is a denial of justice as recognition. We are talking about democratic fundamentals here. The state being responsible for the deaths of its own citizens is arguably the ultimate taboo in a democratic society. As the European Court of Human Rights has pointed out, what is at stake here is nothing less than public confidence in the state's monopoly on the use of force. The public needs answers it can trust when it comes to deaths at the hands of the police, and I think the stakes are such that it is both wrong and unrealistic to expect the executive or the media to independently provide those answers routinely. Public accountability can only be fulfilled where the state provides a forum in which deaths at the hands of the state are routinely and systematically, independently and effectively investigated and publicly investigated. Case law under Article 2, the right to life of the European Convention on Human Rights, has developed an obligation amongst member states of the Council of Europe to do just that, to have these independent and public investigations. In Britain, the case law has had a significant impact. In England and Wales, deaths at the hands of the police are typically invested through judicial procedures known as inquests. They take place in courts which are open to the public and the press and are conducted in front of a public jury. The family of the deceased have the same status as the police and other state actors at these inquests, and they can question witnesses and they can make submissions to the coroner, who's a type of judge. And unlike criminal trials, the jury, which is made up of 13 members of the public, is also allowed to put questions to witnesses. Now, we still rely on the media to report the progress and findings of these investigations, but I think as two of the examples I've given show that even the most pro-authoritarian of the British press have found it impossible to ignore the authoritativeness of these investigations. So in short, at their best, these processes involve a procedure which is just by giving voice to those affected by a death, and they are capable of at least fulfilling certain aspects of remedial justice by producing a just public narrative which is based on rigorously tested evidence. And finally, I'd like to just give a quick quote from Carol Pounder, who's the mother of Adam Rickwood, and she gave this quote after an inquest into her son's death, Adam Rickwood's death, and that inquest revealed unlawful restraint techniques being habitually deployed against children in secure training centres. And her son Adam was the youngest person in recent history to die. He was only 14 years old when he died. They're basically prisons. They're called secure training centres. So after the inquest, the Journal newspaper quotes his tearful mother, Carol Pounder, said, "I've waited over 6 years for truth and justice. Nothing can bring Adam back. All I have ever wanted is to find out the truth about what happened to my son and for those responsible for unlawful assaults to be held to account." Now, there was no prosecution in this case, and this was before she received any kind of compensation, but there was still that justice that was just in having that public acknowledgement of what went wrong and what the truth was in that case. Thank you very much.